The sun was setting over Graceland, casting a golden glow over the sprawling estate. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes you wonder if something is terribly wrong. And it was. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was lying on the floor of his bathroom, lifeless. His body was bloated and blue, a stark contrast to the vibrant man he once was. The paramedics had tried to save him, but it was too late. Elvis was dead, and no one knew why. Ginger Alden, Elvis's fiancée, was in shock. She had woken up a few hours earlier, calling out, "Elvis, Elvis," but there was no response. She found him in the bathroom, and her world crumbled. The last thing she remembered was the book on psychic energy lying open on the table, as if it held the answers to the unanswerable. Dan Warlick, an investigator from the medical examiner's office, arrived on the scene. He took one look at Elvis's body and knew something was terribly wrong. The Ep-Doa note on Elvis's chart said it all: Elvis Presley, dead on arrival. The paramedics had struggled to lift his body, which weighed around 250 pounds, onto the stretcher. The ride to Baptist Hospital was frantic, but the resuscitation efforts were futile. The autopsy revealed no clear cause of death. Elvis's heart was enlarged, but serious heart disease was still years away, according to the medical examiner, Jerry Francisco. Yet Francisco's announcement of cardiac arrhythmia as the cause of death left more questions than answers. Meanwhile, in New York, Geraldo Rivera and his team at ABC 2020 were piecing together a different story. They had first-hand confirmation that Elvis had taken a large number of drugs in the hours before his death. Rivera and his colleague, Charlie Thompson, had interviewed eyewitnesses and obtained confidential documents that painted a picture of a man deeply addicted to prescription drugs. As Rivera and Thompson worked on their expose, they discovered that Dr. George Nichopoulos, Elvis's personal physician, had been overprescribing drugs for years. The list of drugs found in Elvis's system was alarming: Dilaudid, Demerol, Valium, and more. The Healing Arts Board had even filed a complaint against Nichopoulos, but the doctor denied all allegations. The 2020 team knew they were onto something big. They screened their interviews with Dr. Noel Florendo, who said there was no evidence of a heart attack, and Dr. Cyril Wecht, a forensic pathologist, who stated bluntly that drugs had killed Elvis. They also had footage of Nichopoulos, who denied everything, and the long list of drugs from the complaint scrolling across the screen. But just as they were finalizing their broadcast, a bombshell hit. A lawyer named Ken Masterson, representing Nichopoulos, called to demand a second interview with the doctor with conditions. Thompson and Rivera refused, and the lawyer threatened to sue. The news broke on the wires, and the story was out before 2020 could air their findings. Despite the setback, 2020 went ahead with their broadcast. The show, titled The Elvis Cover-Up, was a sensation. Millions of viewers tuned in, and the revelations about Elvis's drug addiction and the doctors who enabled it left the country stunned. But the story was far from over. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner, held a press conference the next day, denying any cover-up and standing by his original ruling. The controversy only intensified, and the 2020 team knew they had a fight on their hands. As the credits rolled, Rivera looked into the camera and said, "Reporting this story has been a melancholy personal experience for me, because I wanted it not to be true, but it was true. By the end of his life, Elvis Presley had become a medical addict." The phone lines at ABC were flooded with calls. Some viewers were angry, others were in disbelief. But one thing was clear: Elvis's death was a mystery that would not be easily solved. The press conference was buzzing with reporters and cameras, all eager to hear what the medical examiner, Dr. Jerry Francisco, had to say about Elvis Presley's death. Dr. Francisco, a tall man with a confident air, stood at the podium, ready to defend his conclusion that Elvis died from a heart condition, not from drugs. Dr. Francisco began by saying that disagreements among doctors were normal. It's the job of a forensic pathologist to know that whatever you say, someone will disagree, he explained. He added that the more famous the person, the more likely there would be disagreements. This was especially true for someone as famous as Elvis. Then Dr. Francisco started to criticize clinical pathologists, who he believed were not qualified to determine the cause of death. He particularly targeted Dr. Noel Florendo, a member of the team that performed Elvis's autopsy at Baptist Hospital. Dr. Francisco said that clinical pathologists were used to seeing heart disease develop over time, while forensic pathologists, like himself, were more familiar with sudden deaths from heart attacks. However, Dr. Francisco didn't mention the small hemorrhages on Elvis's upper torso, which suggested that death wasn't as sudden as he claimed. He also didn't talk about the dozens of microscopic slides that showed Elvis was far from having serious heart problems, according to Dr. Eric Muirhead, who had mentored Dr. Florendo. A reporter asked Dr. Francisco about the data that led him to disagree with the independent pathologists, who concluded that Elvis died from drug use. Dr. Francisco rubbed his chin and said he had to speculate because he didn't know what data ABC had given their experts. He said ABC probably had less information than his office, which had the autopsy report, lab results, and other details about Elvis's medical history. When asked about the contents of Elvis's stomach, Dr. Francisco said there was nothing to analyze and that even if there was, it wouldn't matter. He explained that the contents of the stomach were outside the body and only became relevant if they were absorbed into the body. This surprised many of the reporters, as they knew that stomach contents were usually important in forensic investigations. The conversation turned to the district attorney's investigation into Dr. George Nichopoulos, Elvis's doctor. A reporter asked if this investigation made Dr. Francisco doubt his findings. Dr. Francisco insisted it didn't, saying that there was no medical evidence to support the idea that Dr. Nichopoulos caused Elvis's death. Another reporter asked about the combination of sedatives and codeine in Elvis's system. Dr. Francisco said that codeine would only be significant if all the drugs were at toxic levels, and the sedatives were at therapeutic levels, which were typical for a heart patient. As the press conference wound down, Charlie Thompson, a reporter from ABC 2020, rushed into the room. He had missed most of the conference but was given a quick briefing by Joan Droge, a reporter from WHBQ-TV. Droge told Thompson that Dr. Francisco hadn't changed his mind about anything, and that many reporters didn't believe him. Thompson, frustrated, wrote a response to Dr. Francisco, emphasizing that the medical examiner had refused to answer many of the same questions under oath. Thompson said he would ask a judge to compel Dr. Francisco to answer these questions, and if he still refused, seek a contempt citation. Thompson believed the public had the right to know if they had been misled. The next day, the front page of the newspaper featured a photo of Dr. Francisco and a headline that read, "Examiner is firm, heart disease fatal to Presley." The article, written by Dennis L. Brio for American Medical News, was critical of 2020's investigation. Brio relied heavily on Dr. Francisco's account and ignored the toxic ranges that were crucial in forensic investigation. He also made personal attacks on the doctors who had disagreed with Dr. Francisco, particularly Dr. Cyril Wecht, a well-known forensic pathologist. Jim Cole, one of the 2020 reporters, was shocked by the article. He wrote a letter to American Medical News, detailing the poor reporting and asking why Brio had been allowed to write such a one-sided attack. The newspaper printed a toned-down version of Cole's letter, but never explained why Brio had been so biased. Dr. Wecht, who was personally attacked in the article, fought back. He filed a lawsuit against the American Medical Association and others, which was eventually settled in his favor. Despite the challenges, Thompson and Cole continued their investigation. They believed that the truth about Elvis's death was still out there, and they were determined to find it. Cole knew he had to dig deeper. He had a hunch that the truth about Elvis Presley's death was hidden somewhere in the details. He started by reaching out to the toxicologists, whose names Francisco had mentioned in his press release. The first call was to Dr. Brian Finkel, a toxicologist from the University of Utah. Finkel's British accent was crisp and clear over the phone. "I did speak with Dr. Francisco," Finkel said, "but I never considered myself his official consultant. We just discussed some data, and he told me his conclusion. I have no way to agree or disagree with him." Finkel explained that determining a cause of death involves investigating the circumstances, the medical and pathological findings, and the lab results. He added that a few weeks later, he did become involved in the Presley case, but only through bioscience laboratories. "I was only asked to review some tissue samples. I never saw the full report, just my own findings," Finkel clarified. When Cole asked if Finkel's results contradicted the other toxicology tests, the answer was a firm no. It seemed that Finkel's work was consistent with the other lab's findings. Next, Cole called Dr. Robert Blank, a toxicologist from the Medical College of Virginia. Blank's story was more complicated. "Francisco did contact me, but he didn't mention Elvis's name," Blank said. "He told me about the drug levels, and based on that, I agreed that it looked like a drug-related death." But Blank was troubled by what he read in the local newspaper after Francisco's press conference. The article reported different drug levels and omitted some altogether. Blank was so disturbed that he wrote Francisco a letter on October 25, 1977, expressing his concerns. "The media often distorts facts, but I was worried that my opinion might have been misinterpreted," Blank wrote. He listed the discrepancies between what Francisco told him and what was reported in the news. For example, the news story mentioned higher levels of pentobarbital and ethanamate, which Francisco hadn't shared with Blank. Blank also pointed out that the news omitted any mention of Valium, which Francisco had told him could be lethal. Blank concluded his letter by saying that he believed the combination of drugs at the reported levels would be consistent with a drug death, but he was surprised to see that the press release claimed 2 toxicologists disagreed with the drug-related cause of death. "I haven't heard back from Dr. Francisco," Blank told Cole. With Finkel and Blank's accounts, it was clear that Francisco's claim of having outside toxicologists agree with his conclusions was shaky at best. Cole realized that Francisco was almost alone in his opinion. The next step was to dig into the legal battle to uncover more details. Dr. George Nichopoulos, Elvis's personal physician, was being deposed by 2020's legal team. Nichopoulos was under intense pressure. His medical license was on the line, and he was being investigated for overprescribing drugs to Elvis and other patients. The deposition was tense. Nichopoulos's lawyers, Frank Crawford and Ken Masterson, were aggressively trying to protect their client. Opposing them were Mike Pleasance, Chuck Harrell, and Dr. John Fiegel, a forensic pathologist and attorney. The room was filled with tension as Pleasance grilled Nichopoulos about Elvis's death. Pleasance's subpoena required Nichopoulos to bring all documents related to Elvis's case. Among these documents were a letter from Dr. Thomas Chesney, a member of the Baptist Hospital autopsy team, and a death certificate Nichopoulos had attempted to file. The letter from Chesney showed that Elvis's heart disease was mild, and his other organs were not diseased. This contradicted Francisco's conclusion that Elvis died from heart disease. The death certificate, filled out by Nichopoulos before the toxicology results were back, listed cardiac arrhythmia, coronary artery disease, hypertension, and diabetes mellitus as the causes of death, along with a fatty liver. Fiegel, Thompson, and Cole were stunned. They realized that Nichopoulos had tried to cover up the real cause of Elvis's death. Pleasance pressed Nichopoulos on why he filled out the death certificate before the autopsy results were in. Nichopoulos seemed confused and couldn't provide a clear answer. The deposition revealed that Nichopoulos had never seen the final autopsy report. Dr. Eric Muirhead, the chief pathologist at Baptist Hospital, told Nichopoulos that Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, ordered that Nichopoulos never receive a copy of the report. The legal battle was just the beginning. Dick Grob, former chief of security at Graceland, was another key figure. After the 2020 broadcast, Grob spoke at several Presley fan clubs, criticizing Ginger Alden, David and Ricky Stanley, and 2020 for their portrayal of Elvis's drug use and declining health. Grob's comments, filled with bitterness and sarcasm, appeared in fan club newsletters across the country. Grob's account suggested that the night Elvis died, things went wrong. Ricky Stanley, one of Elvis's aides, was heavily under the influence of drugs and failed to check on Elvis. David Stanley, who was supposed to relieve Ricky, also neglected his duties. Grob's version of events added another layer of complexity to the story. Cole knew that uncovering the truth about Elvis Presley's death was a tangled web of conflicting stories, hidden documents, and personal interests. But he was determined to keep digging, no matter how deep the rabbit hole went. In the weeks after the 2020 broadcast, the controversy over Elvis Presley's death intensified. Dick Grob, known for his aggressive stance against the broadcast, was particularly harsh on Ginger Alden, Elvis's fiancée. He posed a series of rhetorical questions, wondering where Ginger was during the time Elvis died and if she had watched him die. Grob claimed to have some answers, but none from Ginger herself. He said he got into the investigation because of a photo of Elvis's coffin taken by a distant cousin for the National Enquirer, and a conversation with Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. Grob's investigation led him to James Kirk, a freelance reporter for the National Enquirer. Kirk claimed he received a phone call around 11:30 a.m. on the day Elvis died, which he believed came from Ginger Alden. The call instructed him to go to Graceland because something was going on. A second call at 2 p.m. told him to bring money. Kirk said he arranged to pay Ginger $105,000 for her exclusive story, but the Enquirer later reduced the payment to $35,000 because Ginger had already given an interview to the Commercial Appeal. Charlie Thompson, a journalist, found James Kirk and spoke to him. Kirk repeated his story, confirming that the calls came from a young woman he believed to be Ginger. He had spoken to her before and had a deal to pay her for her story. When Thompson confronted Ginger and her mother, Jo Laverne, they admitted to knowing Kirk but denied making the calls. Ginger was upset that anyone would think she was trying to make money from Elvis's death. This created a dilemma for Thompson, who found Kirk credible but also believed the Aldens when they were convinced he had the goods on them. Thompson and Jim Cole, a producer for 2020, decided to take Dick Grob's deposition to get more information. Grob hired an attorney to fight the subpoena, claiming that it was an abusive process and that his manuscript, The Elvis Conspiracy, was protected by copyright. However, the court ordered Grob to appear and produce any documents related to Elvis's death and autopsy. During the deposition, Chuck Harrell, Thompson's attorney, asked Grob if he had ever seen the autopsy report. Grob initially said he had seen what he thought was the report, but admitted he didn't have possession of it and hadn't read it. When asked about the contents of the autopsy, Grob said he had never seen it and couldn't confirm its contents. Harrell then read a passage from Grob's manuscript, which claimed that Elvis was dying of bone cancer. Grob admitted that this was speculative and not based on factual evidence. He said he had never seen the autopsy report and couldn't determine if the information was factual. Harrell also asked Grob about the intercom system in Elvis's bathroom. Grob said there were two systems, one connected to the phone and another that was a speaker-type system. However, the second system had been inoperative for years, meaning Elvis couldn't have used it to call for help. Grob was also asked about who cleaned up Elvis's bathroom and bedroom before the arrival of the homicide detectives. He said he had no idea. Meanwhile, Mike Pleasance, the attorney, was working with Dr. John Fiegel, a forensic pathologist, to prepare for depositions with Dr. Jerry Francisco's assistants, DRS, James Bell and Charles Harlan. Bell, who was disheveled and without a lawyer, confirmed that he had written a note saying, "Ep Doa BMH Odd, Elvis Presley, dead on arrival, Baptist Memorial Hospital, overdose," and handed it to investigator Dan Warlick. Bell admitted that his initial suspicion was homicide, but he changed his mind after a staff meeting where Francisco showed him reports. Dr. Charles Harlan, the other assistant, relied on a bogus medical history of the Presley family. He incorrectly stated that Gladys Presley, Elvis's mother, died of heart disease and diabetes at age 42. In reality, she died of cirrhosis of the liver at age 46, exacerbated by alcohol and drug abuse. Harlan also admitted that he had no idea which toxicology charts he had reviewed to determine the cause of Elvis's death. On December 14, 1977, Jerry Francisco's second deposition was held. Francisco produced Polaroid pictures of Elvis's bathroom, showing the black toilet, red carpet, and a discoloration. He explained that the photos had been in a separate correspondence file. When asked about the records he used for an interview with American Medical News, where he had freely discussed drug levels, Francisco struggled to provide specific answers. The depositions and investigations continued to uncover inconsistencies and raise more questions about the circumstances of Elvis Presley's death. Charlie Thompson and Jim Cole were deep into their investigation of Elvis Presley's death. They were piecing together a puzzle that seemed to have more missing pieces than anyone could imagine. The more they dug, the more they realized that the story of Elvis's last moments was far from the clean, sanitized version that the public had been given. Ulysses Jones, a fire department paramedic, was one of the first people to arrive at Graceland on August 16, 1977. He had been called to the scene by Joe Esposito, a member of Elvis's entourage. When Jones got there, he found a chaotic scene. People were frantically trying to revive Elvis, who was already very much dead. Jones was shocked when he realized that the obese man, whom he initially thought was black, was actually Elvis Presley. Al Strada, a friend of Elvis, had told Jones, "We think he odd." Despite this, Jones never received any of the medications Elvis had taken, not from Dr. Nichopoulos or anyone else. When Jones and his partner returned to the bathroom for their equipment, they noticed that everything had been cleaned up meticulously, as if to erase any evidence of what had really happened. The Memphis police records added another layer of confusion. According to the records, Dr. Nichopoulos, Elvis's personal physician, had told the investigators that Elvis had only taken 2 Valiums and 1 other pill in the hours before his death. This didn't align with the testimony of eyewitnesses, the toxicology reports, or the list of drugs that Nichopoulos had prescribed to Elvis just the day before. It raised questions about whether Nichopoulos was being entirely honest with the authorities. Thompson and Cole found more disturbing information. Nichopoulos claimed he had accounted for all the dilated pills he had prescribed to Elvis, but he never turned them over to the paramedics or the medical examiner's investigator. He also didn't mention the hundreds of other narcotic pills and injectables he had prescribed on August 15, 1977. Instead, he told the hospital's chief pathologist, Dr. Eric Muirhead, that he had given Elvis a pain pill after a dentist visit. Muirhead found Nichopoulos's behavior suspicious, especially when the toxicology reports came back. The investigation took an even stranger turn when a small ad appeared in the Memphis Commercial Appeal in October 1979. The ad offered to sell one of Elvis's last prescription bottles. Thompson and Cole tracked down the couple who had placed the ad, Randy and Amy McCord. The McCords were asking $1,000 for the bottle, but refused to show it to Cole after learning he was a reporter. They described the bottle in detail, and it matched one of the prescriptions Nichopoulos had written for Elvis on August 15, 1977. However, the origin of the bottle couldn't be verified, and the state investigators weren't particularly interested. The evidence of drug abuse at Graceland finally caught the attention of the District Attorney General's office in Memphis. Hugh W. Stanton, Jr., assigned a team of investigators to dig through more than 6 million drug prescriptions to build a case against Dr. Nichopoulos. The investigation, dubbed Operation Dr. Nick, was a significant step, but it had taken 2 years to get started. Larry Hutchinson, the chief criminal investigator, had been pushing for this investigation for a long time. He believed that the involvement of drugs in Elvis's death was obvious, but the office had been hesitant to take on the case, partly due to fear of crossing Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner. Tennessee State Senator Jim White, a former newspaper reporter, was more direct in his criticism. He met with Francisco and told him that the public had the right to know the full details of Elvis's death. The legislature of Tennessee really intended that the public be fully satisfied that death under these circumstances be public knowledge, White said. Despite this, Francisco refused to talk directly to ABC News, though he did give an interview to Joan Droge of WHBQ-TV, which was later shared with Thompson and Cole. When 2020 aired its second broadcast on December 27, 1979, it was a ratings success. Geraldo Rivera, who had returned to Memphis, helped Thompson and Cole put together the show. They reviewed the findings from the first broadcast, discussed the malpractice charges against Dr. Nichopoulos, and detailed his role in concealing Elvis's drug addiction. They also revealed that Nichopoulos had tried to file a false death certificate, which Francisco had blocked. The broadcast included a portion of Droge's interview with Francisco, where he refused to reopen the case, saying, "There's nothing to reopen." To provide a technical perspective, 2020 brought in Dr. John Fiegel, a deputy medical examiner from Atlanta with over 20 years of experience in investigating suspicious deaths. Rivera introduced Fiegel to the viewers, emphasizing his expertise in the field. The investigation was far from over, but with each new revelation, the truth about Elvis's death was slowly coming to light. Dr. Fiegel had a strong opinion about the pills Elvis Presley was taking. He thought the number of pills was very important, and could have been a big part of what led to Elvis's death. If Fiegel were in Jerry Francisco's shoes, he said he would have reopened the case right away. This was because he believed the 196 prescriptions for over 12,000 pills were a big deal. But Jerry Francisco, who was the medical examiner, didn't want to look into the case again. Some people, like Rivera, thought there might be two reasons for this. Either Francisco made a mistake and didn't want to admit it, or he might have tried to hide the real reason Elvis died. Rivera and his team on ABC 2020 show found some evidence that Francisco might have twisted the truth about what the experts said. Rivera talked to Dr. Brian Finkel and Dr. Robert Blank, the two experts Francisco said he consulted. Dr. Finkel told the team that he couldn't form an opinion based on the limited information he had. Dr. Blank said the drugs, when taken together, were consistent with a drug-related death. But Francisco's press release didn't mention this part of what Dr. Blank said. Rivera believed that because of the lack of honesty, there was never a proper investigation into Elvis's death. The 2020 show was very popular, even though it aired during a time when most people were focused on the holidays. The show also talked about Dr. George Nichopoulos, who was Elvis's doctor. Nichopoulos was going to have hearings to see if he would lose his medical license. He was giving sworn testimony to lawyers who were preparing for the hearings. Nichopoulos and his lawyers tried to blame 2020 for the charges against him. They argued that if 2020 hadn't been involved, Nichopoulos wouldn't be on trial. During his deposition, Nichopoulos talked about his background. He grew up in Alabama, dropped out of college to join the Army, and eventually went to medical school. He had a family with 3 children and was married for 25 years. His son Dean worked for the Presley estate, which Nichopoulos didn't seem too happy about. When asked if he had any complaints about his work, Nichopoulos said the only complaints came after the 2020 show. He also talked about his interview with Rivera, the 2020 correspondent. Nichopoulos said Rivera and his team were very persistent, and he felt pressured to do the interview. He initially refused to answer Rivera's questions, but eventually gave in. Rivera showed him a folder with prescriptions and asked if they were his. Nichopoulos confirmed they were. On the second and third days of his deposition, Nichopoulos tried to defend himself by saying that not all the 12,000 pills were meant for Elvis. He claimed that many of the drugs were for other people in Elvis's entourage, including Colonel Tom Parker. When asked what drugs Elvis actually took, Nichopoulos tried to downplay the number, suggesting that Elvis's entourage shared the drugs. The deposition was tense, with Nichopoulos' lawyers objecting to many of the state's questions. Nichopoulos seemed more comfortable talking about 2020 than about the formal complaint he was facing. But as the deposition continued, he had to face tough questions about his treatment of Elvis and the drugs he prescribed. Dr. Nichopoulos, Elvis Presley's personal physician, was under intense scrutiny during his deposition. The room was filled with lawyers, and the tension was thick. Nichopoulos was rattling off a long list of drugs that Elvis had taken, and the prosecutor, Frank Scanlon, was struggling to keep up. "Doctor, just a minute," Scanlon pleaded. But Nichopoulos continued listing more drugs: Amytal, Placidil, Tuinal, Percotin, Dexamyl, Ionamine. Scanlon, a methodical man, was driven crazy by Nichopoulos' rapid-fire recitation. He interrupted again. "Excuse me, doctor, have you gone through the whole list?" "Not yet," Nichopoulos answered, adding more drugs to the list, biphetamine and quaaludes. "I may have omitted something, but I'm sure you'll come back to it. Oh, the Valium." Nichopoulos tried to refer to his office records, but admitted they were not well kept. He explained that he didn't write down much on Elvis's medical charts because so many people had access to the records. This raised more questions about his medical practices. Elvis, according to Nichopoulos, never slept without some sort of pill, and was especially fond of Dilaudid, a powerful painkiller. Nichopoulos claimed that 80% of the time, he gave Elvis placebos instead of the real drug. "And I would imagine that 80% of the time these were placebos that we gave him," he said. When asked what he did with the real Dilaudid, Nichopoulos answered, "Usually threw it away." This led to more questions. If Elvis was getting mostly placebos, Why did Nichopoulos keep ordering so much real Dilaudid? Nichopoulos explained that Elvis was suspicious and would check the drug bills. If he saw a smaller amount being spent on Dilaudid, he would know something was up. So Nichopoulos had to keep ordering large amounts to keep Elvis from finding out. But if Elvis was mostly getting placebos, was he really addicted to Dilaudid? Nichopoulos responded, hard to get addicted on placebos. This seemed to contradict his earlier statements. The lawyers pressed him further, asking why he had written letters to the drug company saying Elvis was addicted. Nichopoulos insisted that was the only way he could get the placebos from the company. The questioning then turned to the other drugs Nichopoulos prescribed. He admitted to substituting and throwing away many of the drugs. For example, with Demerol, a powerful painkiller, he sometimes substituted it with phenobarbital or water. He even admitted to giving Elvis only part of the dose, squirting the rest on the floor to avoid detection. Nichopoulos estimated that Elvis actually consumed about 80 to 85% of the dexedrine, an amphetamine, and 100% of the amytal, a sedative. He also said Elvis took most of his other drugs, including Placidil, Tuinal, and Percodan. However, he claimed that some of the drugs, like Quaaludes, were used by other members of Elvis's entourage. The doctor also mentioned that he prepared envelopes of drugs for Elvis 4 or 5 times a day. Elvis had 4 retainers who took turns as his valet, and they, along with nurses Tish Henley and Marion Koch, dispensed the drugs at Graceland. Nichopoulos also noted that his medical bag, filled with Elvis's drugs, was stolen twice in 1977, forcing him to reorder large quantities of drugs. However, the police later recovered one of the stolen bags, which contained evidence that would cause Nichopoulos trouble later. Nichopoulos also revealed that other doctors, like Dr. Elias Gainem, had also given drugs to Elvis. He even mentioned an acupuncture practitioner who nearly killed Elvis with a combination of Novocaine, Demerol, and steroids. This led to Elvis's first detoxification in 1973, where he was treated by Dr. David H. Knott and Dr. Robert D. Fink, who specialized in drug addiction. Nichopoulos said that while they were able to wean Elvis off Demerol temporarily, Elvis's drug dependence persisted. When asked about Elvis's drug dependence, Nichopoulos admitted, he thought there was a drug for everything. If he sprained an ankle, he'd much rather go get an acupuncture and take a chance of getting immediate relief than for me to treat him for a couple of days with anti-inflammatory drugs and bed rest. He also mentioned that Elvis once went to a sleep clinic for 3 days, where he was kept awake to break his dependence on sleep drugs, but it failed. The lawyers were particularly interested in Elvis's amphetamine use. Nichopoulos claimed that Elvis was not dependent on amphetamines, but was dependent on a strange drug from Sweden that he believed cleansed his body. Elvis, according to Nichopoulos, didn't like to take baths and thought these pills allowed him to skip bathing. Nichopoulos believed this was more of a psychological dependence. As the deposition neared its end, Nichopoulos' lawyers provided a list of defense witnesses, including Dr. Jerry T. Francisco. However, they admitted that the list was not complete, and they were still trying to contact other potential witnesses. The deposition revealed a complex and troubling picture of Elvis's drug use and Nichopoulos' questionable medical practices. The hearing was just beginning, and more revelations were sure to come. The Nichopoulos hearing began on a chilly Monday morning, January 14, 1980, in the grand chambers of the Memphis City Council. The room was packed with a mix of Elvis fans, curious onlookers, and a swarm of journalists, all eager to witness the unfolding drama. As the hearing officer, Michael Bramham, rapped his gavel to start the proceedings, he sternly reminded everyone that this was not a public forum and that no disruptions would be tolerated. John J. Buddy Tomason, Nichopoulos' fierce lead attorney, immediately voiced his concerns. The cameras, he argued, were crowding the space, blocking the view of the spectators, and turning the hearing into a media circus. "This isn't a hearing, it's a media event," he grumbled, his thick eyeglasses reflecting the bright lights. The hearing was a high-stakes affair, with the state of Tennessee, represented by Joe Dugman and his colleagues from the Attorney General's office, accusing Dr. George Nichopoulos of overprescribing drugs to Elvis Presley and other patients. The prosecution was determined to prove that Nichopoulos' actions had contributed to Elvis's untimely death. However, Dugman was frustrated by the lack of support from his colleagues, who seemed more interested in avoiding controversy than in pursuing justice. Meanwhile, Harold Sexton, the pathologist from Baptist Hospital, had gathered a team of experts to support his theory that drugs, not heart problems, had killed Elvis. Dr. Cravey, a forensic toxicologist, had already concluded that the high levels of codeine and other drugs in Elvis's system were enough to cause death. Dr. Baselt and Dr. Lundberg, both highly respected in their fields, agreed with Cravey's findings, adding that the combination of drugs was fatal. Sexton's efforts were complicated by the unexpected turn of events involving Brian Finkel, a toxicologist who had initially supported the prosecution's case, but was now rumored to be testifying for Nichopoulos. Jim Cole, a key player in the 2020 investigation, was working behind the scenes to uncover Finkel's motives and to find additional experts to support the prosecution's case. As the hearing progressed, the tension in the room was palpable. Nichopoulos' defense team was preparing to argue that Elvis's lifestyle and unique needs justified the high volume of prescriptions. They were also planning to use the autopsy results to their advantage, despite the prosecution's efforts to obtain and review the full records. Joe Dugman, feeling increasingly isolated, continued to push for a thorough examination of the evidence. He believed that the less sensational cases, where Nichopoulos had prescribed drugs to patients like Ivan Cook, would ultimately be the most damning. Dugman was determined to ensure that the 5 physicians on the panel had all the facts, not just the selective testimony of Dr. Francisco and his team. The hearing was just beginning, but the stakes were already clear. The fate of Dr. George Nichopoulos and the legacy of Elvis Presley hung in the balance. As the cameras rolled and the witnesses took the stand, everyone in the room knew that the next few days would be crucial in determining the truth behind the king's tragic death.